Eric, as you said, the president posting on Truth Social. We now have that for our viewers to look at on the screen. There it is. The United States of America has successfully carried out a large-scale strike against Venezuela and its leader, President Nicolas Maduro, who has been, along with his wife, captured and flown out of the country. This operation was done in conjunction with U.S. law enforcement. Details to follow. There will be a news conference today, 11 a.m. at Mar-a-Lago. Thank you for your attention to this matter. President Donald J. Trump, unprecedented action in Venezuela overnight. Let's talk more about it with Fox News correspondent Lucas Tomlinson, who's there in West Palm Beach, Florida. Lucas.
Well, Chanley, good morning. When we saw the videos of U.S. military helicopters, likely from the 160th Special Operations Regiment, the Night Stalkers, the most elite pilots in the world, we knew that U.S. ground forces could be involved in some kind of snatch and grab operation. Now we have it confirmed from President Trump that Venezuelan leader Nicolas Maduro and his wife have been snatched under the cover of darkness, under airstrikes throughout Caracas, as well as their major port in the north of Caracas, that this operation was in some ways a law enforcement operation to grab Maduro and his wife because of the charges against him. Recall, there's a $50 million bounty on Maduro's head. We just heard Maduro a day ago almost pleading with President Trump that he wanted to make a deal. But we heard from President Trump for weeks now, over a dozen times, he pledged there would be strikes on land. And when it comes to an operation like this, our viewers might be wondering, where did these helicopters come from? Well, you have a number of flat tops in the region. You have the USS Gerald R. Ford aircraft carrier. You also have the USS Iwo Jima, which is an amphibious assault ship. Doesn't have catapults to launch jets like an aircraft carrier, but does carry dozens of helicopters. Could have been used as a launching pad. Remember, you also saw a converted freighter called the Ocean Trader off the coast of Venezuela, and some of these special operations helicopters flying almost show of force missions, almost a rehearsal for what we saw tonight. And this is not without precedent. In 1989, the U.S. Army parachuted in and seized Manuel Noriega from Panama in 1989, if you remember, and to also carry out with the U.S. military a law enforcement operation. And that's what President Trump said in that post. He said there will be a press conference at 11 a.m. this morning to discuss this with the world and the American public. We have seen unprecedented strikes from the United States in Venezuela early this morning, beginning at about 1 a.m. Eastern, about 2 o'clock a.m. local in Caracas, after this large-scale military buildup we've been seeing from weeks, really going back to September, with the droning of those drug boats in the Caribbean and the Eastern Pacific. We've also seen squadrons of F-35 stealth fighter jets from the U.S. Air Force landing in Puerto Rico, the F-35 Bravo version from the Marine Corps. We've seen Iwo Jima. We've seen Gerald Ford conducting flight operations. We've also seen those KC-135 refueling birds landing in places like the Dominican Republic. We saw from people going on vacation, firing off posts showing those refueling planes on the ground. So I spoke to Elliot Abrams, President Trump's former U.S. Special Envoy to Venezuela, just a few weeks ago down in Trinidad, and he said that this was a showdown between President Trump and Venezuelan leader Nicolas Maduro, and there could only be one winner, and President Trump doesn't like to lose. And you knew that with this large-scale buildup, it likely would not be drawn down until something like this happened. And this has been in the works for days, we were told. However, you had the strike against ISIS in Nigeria on Christmas Day. For the past few days, we've been getting some signs this could be underway, the planning of the operation. But early this morning, we got word of those large-scale strikes. And you saw the video, thanks to the iPhone and social media. We saw these U.S. Army helicopters under the cover of darkness flying low. We saw Apache gunships. We saw likely H-1 Viper Marine Corps attack helicopters, likely from Iwo Jima or some of the other amphibious warships in the Caribbean. Recall, there's about a dozen U.S. warships in the Caribbean on station. And when we saw these attack helicopters striking targets at very close range, notice there wasn't any return fire that we saw on social media from the Venezuelans. It's likely that the U.S. military had disabled Venezuela's air defense systems, its radar. There are a number of aircraft that could have made that happen. The EA-18 Growlers aboard the Gerald Ford. You also had a squadron of those Growlers deployed from their home base in Whidbey Island in Washington to Puerto Rico. There's just a large-scale buildup. We're seeing the fruition of that earlier this morning with the seizing of Venezuelan leader Nicolas Maduro. And it has been not without precedent, though. Remember, in 1989 with the seizing of Manuel Noriega in Panama, Chanley.
Lining the immense power of the U.S. military, not only there in Venezuela, but in the region leading up to this. You have military experience, of course, yourself. You know what you're talking about. Speak about the intelligence that went into pinpointing the location of the Venezuelan president, who likely was asleep. It was 2 a.m., right, in the middle of the night, there with his wife. Now, you mentioned he's under indictment here in the U.S., so the DOJ now in their possession. Are you surprised they also took his wife?
Well, she was likely in the room with Maduro. That is why they seized her. These were likely Tier 1 Special Operations Forces, the Delta Force, SEAL Team 6, who would have gone in. We can't confirm those units. Would have gone in and grabbed Maduro and his wife. If his wife was there, they probably would have grabbed her too. But you're spot on pointing out the intelligence. There probably only a certain number of compounds where Maduro would reside. He has spoken in the past about bunkers he has used, but there's no question he is heavily defended. We've heard about not just his security forces, but also Cuban security forces that have been closely guarding him for weeks. But perhaps to tip off this operation, that interview with Maduro yesterday, you could almost hear in his voice he was pleading for the Trump administration. He wanted a deal. He wanted to get American oil companies back in Venezuela. Venezuela has the largest oil reserves in the world, even larger than Saudi Arabia. We've seen the seizing of those oil tankers off the coast of Venezuela that the Trump administration has sanctioned and says they're part of the shadow fleet. We've seen Coast Guard Special Operations Forces fast roping aboard some of those tankers and seizing them. One is at anchor in Galveston, right there off the coast of Texas. This has been a tightening of the noose, if you will, of Maduro. But really a daring operation tonight from U.S. Special Operations Forces to seize Maduro and his wife and to know where he is.
Right. President Trump, again, already touting the success of this mission. Let's talk about what we've heard from the Venezuelan government so far. I know you've read the statement that they put out. We're also hearing from the Venezuela defense minister saying that they're compiling information about the dead and injured in the U.S. attack. You know more about the locations that were struck, and would you expect that there would be the collateral damage that Venezuelan government is trying to compile?
And it could have been part of a diversion as well. With these major bases in Caracas, two of them that were struck, their large-scale military base as well as the air base, as well as their largest port just north of Caracas, were struck. Also, Hugo Chavez's mausoleum was reportedly struck in the airstrikes. No question to sow confusion among the Venezuelan forces, to distract them. Also, again, can't be emphasized enough, we did not see any surface-to-air missiles launched from the Venezuelan forces, any AAA anti-aircraft fire. The only fire that we have seen on social media came from U.S. aircraft flying overhead.
I'm Steve Doocy.
I'm Brian Kilmeade.
And I'm Ainsley Earhart. And click here to subscribe to the Fox News YouTube page to catch our hottest interviews and most compelling analysis.